Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Smash JT. In this episode, I'm going to be reviewing Earth Atlantis on the Nintendo Switch eShop and letting you know if it's worth it or not. Let's check it out. Smash JT. Brief disclaimer and thank you to Pixel Perfect Studios for providing this copy to me for review purposes. They got it to me a little bit later than I've ever gotten a review copy before from other companies, which is why this review is coming so late in itself. The game itself actually released on October 5th of 2017 on the Nintendo Switch eShop, but as for right now, I got it only a couple weeks ago and have been pouring a massive amount of time into it, which is good, but that doesn't mean it's a perfect game. Earth Atlantis is a side-scrolling shooter with an original monster hunting gameplay. Search and hunt down dreadful sea monsters and explore the post-apocalyptic underwater world. You unlock multiple ships with special weapons and abilities for your journey and become a legendary hunter. And while this game is technically defined as a side-scrolling shooter from the developer, I'd personally describe it as more of a Metroid game for the original NES, but instead of being Samus shooting enemies, you're a gunship floating around underwater shooting enemies. But the actual map layout and how you actually traverse it is very similar to a Metroid-style gameplay. There were a lot of things I absolutely loved about this game, but before I get to those, I want to talk about the things that were minor nuances that annoyed me but didn't ruin the entire experience on the whole. First off, minor things like you can't hit the enemies while they're turning around doing their spin, which isn't the biggest deal, but when you're turning around doing a spin, you can get hit. And things like that always annoyed me. I hate how if enemies can do something and don't get hit, you should be able to do something and not get hit. And at times there'd be foreground objects that would block your sight where you couldn't even see if there was enemies behind it, or bullets or fire coming through it, and you get hit by things and not even know it was there. It wouldn't feel very fair. And while it's an extremely challenging game, I also struggled with it feeling fair. Like, it was cheap. As I mentioned, there'd be times where you wouldn't be able to see the enemies behind things, or there'd be bullets that you couldn't see, or enemies because they'd blend in with the background. But on top of that, if you got hit, the invincibility would only last like a millisecond, so you could get hit again and again and again, and sometimes it would get really cheap if you had an enemy just drive into you and you wouldn't be able to get away from them. You'd just explode and die without being able to get away and save yourself. And when things got really hectic on the screen, it would be very difficult to tell the difference between friendly fire and enemy fire, because with the graphic style that it has, all the colors are exactly the same for the most part, and all the bullets look extremely similar, so it's very easy to mix them up as you're floating around shooting enemies. The graphics, as you can see, while quite simple, are actually very detailed and awesome. Once you're actually playing the game, you're totally inside this world and you feel like it comes to life even though it's like a hand-drawn kind of graphic. Reminds me a lot of Gunman Clive for the 3DS, if you're familiar with that style. Very similar style of graphics. And just because the graphics are simple does not mean it's a bad thing. I actually really enjoyed the graphics in this game. Although the one drawback to the graphics was they were bland, and oftentimes enemies would blend in with the background and you wouldn't even know if it was an enemy or part of the actual background until they started firing at you. After playing the game long enough, you start to learn what the enemies look like and they start to stand out a little bit more, but oftentimes I'd lose their bullets in the background or miss them still, even though I was expecting to see them there, because they just blended in so much with the background, like camouflage. And as I mentioned earlier, it's very similar to the Metroid style as far as the map layout and being almost like a maze, but the problem with it was the mini-map heads-up display on the game screen was not helpful at all. It was just a big rectangle. It wouldn't tell you exactly where paths would lead. So oftentimes you'd be going through all these long narrow passageways just to lead to a dead end when you're trying to get to the next end boss. Which wouldn't seem like the biggest deal, except for sometimes you'd be going around back and forth through many different paths, fighting all these enemies to get to the end boss, and not being able to get to him because the actual path was a really roundabout way to get to him that makes no sense. Until you've explored every other pathway first, you wouldn't have known to check the last one. And while it may seem like I'm focusing a lot more on the negatives than the positives in this review, that's because it's very simplistic when you get right down to it. And a lot of the things it does right, it nails, and it's a lot of fun to play. The music was absolutely stellar. It was an epic orchestra making you feel like this gigantic adventure was taking place while you were exploring underwater. And the entire soundtrack truly brings this game to life. After you're able to finally defeat the game, it unlocks Hunter Mode, which is basically just a timed version of the story mode where you try to defeat as many end bosses within 10 minutes as possible, and you're able to add time to that 10 minutes from defeating end bosses, and it adds a certain amount of replayability to the game, but I would have liked to see a variety of maps in the game as opposed to just the one map that comes in the story mode. One of my favorite things about this game was being able to defeat other enemy ships underwater and then get them in your arsenal to be able to switch between them. When you die and need to start a new life, you can change a different ship that shoots different directions and has a bunch of different abilities as far as armor, speed, and weapons and what they can do. As far as the controls are concerned, that's where this game absolutely shines. Every time I moved my ship where I wanted to go, I felt like that's exactly where it would go. And for a shoot 'em up game, as far as dodging bullets and where you need to be in very small spots that you have to squeeze out of, that's the kind of thing that a developer has to nail, and they absolutely did in this game. The asking price right now on the eShop is $14.99, and while I had a blast with it, I don't necessarily feel like it's worth $14.99. If you've played to death every other shoot 'em up game that's out there for the Nintendo Switch and you just can't wait to get your hands on another one, then yeah, it's worth the $15 for you, because it's by no means a bad game. That's why my final score for Earth Atlantis is a 7.5. It's a fun game to play, but for $15, that weighs heavily on my decision for the final score of this game. If it were a $5 game or a $6 game, I'd give it an 8.5 or 9, but as far as the value goes, I feel like you're not getting enough bang for your buck for $15 for what this game is providing and all the little detractors and nuances that take away from the enjoyment of it. But if money's not an issue for you, go pick up this game right now. But if you're one of those guys that's looking to save money and look for a fun game, look elsewhere on the eShop. There are a ton of fun games on the eShop right now, and wait for a sale on this one. But definitely pick it up eventually, because this game is a lot of fun once you get your money's worth out of it, which I feel like between $5 and $10 is right in its sweet spot. Anyways, that's all I got for you guys today. Let me know down in the comments below if you've played Earth Atlantis and what you think about it, or if it's something you plan on picking up. Thank you guys so much for watching. Have a good one.